London, 1974. A city where the most reliable thing was the fog and the least reliable was the power grid. The government had graciously introduced the 3-day week, which was essentially a polite British way of saying we were all going to be sitting in the dark, shivering over a lukewarm cup of tea while the economy decided whether or not to pack its bags and leave. But while the streets were piling up with uncollected rubbish and the television screens went black at 10 p.m., something fascinating was happening behind the heavy velvet curtains of the London flats. In the dim, flickering glow of a solitary candle, the British woman was preparing for a very specific kind of war. It wasn't a battle with the unions or the rising price of bread, but a quiet, stubborn conflict with her own reflection. These were the vanished beauty rituals of the 70s, a time when looking your best wasn't merely an act of vanity, it was a calculated act of defiance. In an era defined by industrial decay and social unrest, maintaining one's appearance became the ultimate British stiff upper lip. If the world was going to end in a blackout, she was damn well going to make sure her eyeliner was straight enough to cut glass. Welcome to the shadows of the 70s, where the air smelled of coal smoke and expensive perfume, and where a can of hairspray was the only thing holding the country together. The first rule of survival in a 1974 blackout was knowing exactly where you'd left your kohl pencil. Applying makeup by candlelight is an art form that has thankfully been lost to history, mostly because it required the steady hand of a neurosurgeon and the optimism of a saint. If the candle flickered at the wrong moment, a sharp cat-eye flick could instantly transform into a smudge that suggested you'd recently been punched in a very fashionable way. These kohl pencils weren't the soft, buttery sticks of today. They were as hard as a school HB pencil. To make them usable, you had to soften the tip over a match flame, a delicate procedure where the line between perfectly melted and third-degree eyelid burn was dangerously thin. The result was a gaze so heavy and dark it could stop a bus, or at least distract the driver long enough for you to hop on without a ticket. Then there was the palette of the era, largely dictated by the legendary Biba store in Kensington. This was not the decade for cheerful pinks or sunny yellows. The Biba girl looked as though she lived in a perpetual state of elegant mourning. The preferred shades were bruised purple, muddy brown, and a deep, sickly plum. It was a look that screamed, "I haven't slept since the late 60s, and I find the concept of sunlight offensive." To complete the ensemble, your skin had to be as pale as a ghost in a Victorian attic. A tan was considered vulgar, a sign that you had enough money to flee the British winter, which was seen as a distinct lack of character. You wanted to look fragile, tragic, and slightly malnourished, as if you'd spent the entire afternoon reading French poetry in a drafty hallway. It was the only aesthetic that truly complemented a nation where the heating was off and the wallpaper was peeling. Once the face was painted into a state of mournful perfection, attention turned to the hair, or rather the construction of a chemical fortress. This was the age of the Elnett Shield. In the 70s, hairspray wasn't a styling choice, it was a structural necessity. To step out onto a London street without a coating of lacquer thick enough to stop a bullet was to invite disaster. The goal was a hairstyle that remained utterly motionless, even if you were caught in a gale at the top of an open-topped double-decker bus. You sprayed until the air in your bedroom was more butane than oxygen, creating a shiny, impermeable helmet that smelled vaguely of a chemist's shop and broken promises. It was an incredibly combustible era. One stray spark from a cigarette could turn a Saturday night out into a spectacular, albeit brief, firework display. And then there was the weather. London rain is not a gentle mist, it is a persistent, sideways drizzle designed specifically to ruin a woman's morale. If the hairspray failed, you were left with the frizz, a state of follicular chaos that made you look less like a disco queen and more like a startled spaniel. To combat this, the plastic rain bonnet was the ultimate, albeit deeply unsexy, weapon of choice. It was a crinkly, see-through accessory that folded into a tiny square, transforming an elegant woman into something resembling a human-sized boiled sweet the moment the clouds opened. It was a precarious balance of glamour and survival. You spend 40 minutes teasing your hair into a magnificent gravity-defying shape, only to spend the rest of the evening terrified that a light breeze might cause the whole structure to list dangerously to the left. But that was the price of beauty in a city that seemed determined to melt you back into the pavement. Every woman in 1970s London moved within a personal cloud of olfactory aggression. This was not the era of subtle organic scents or hints of citrus. This was the age of the heavy hitters, fragrances like Charlie, opium, or bluegrass. These were not mere perfumes, they were chemical deterrents designed to be powerful enough to knock a pigeon out of the sky at 20 paces and survive a 3-hour commute on a bus that smelled exclusively of damp wool and stale tobacco. You didn't just apply perfume, you declared war on the atmosphere. In a city where the air was a thick soup of coal smoke, diesel fumes, and the constant lingering haze of Benson and Hedges, your scent had to be loud enough to be heard over the industrial noise. It was a sensory survival tactic. If the world outside smelled like a declining empire, you were determined to smell like a concentrated field of jasmine and musk, even if it gave everyone in the elevator a mild migraine.
And then there was the perpetual tragedy of the nylon ladder. In the 70s, a run in your tights was a national emergency, second only to the rising price of sugar. Because quality hosiery was a luxury your budget couldn't always accommodate, every woman carried a secret weapon in her handbag, a small bottle of clear nail polish. The ritual was as frantic as it was delicate. The moment you felt that dreaded pop of a snag, you had to find a corner, lift your skirt with the dignity of a fallen duchess, and dab a glob of sticky lacquer onto the escaping thread. It was a temporary truce with gravity. By the end of a long day, many a London secretary's legs were a patchwork of dried, shiny scabs of nail polish, holding her dignity together by a single chemical thread. It was an invisible struggle, a silent pact among women who knew that while the country might be unraveling at the seams, their stockings at least would remain intact until they reached the safety of their front door. The professional world of the mid-70s was a hazy arena of smoke, stale tea, and the rhythmic percussive symphony of 100 manual typewriters. This was the era of the typist pool, a place where dreams went to be transcribed into triplicate and filed away in a grey metal cabinet for eternity. It was a room governed by a hierarchy more rigid than the British class system itself, overseen by a senior secretary who possessed a temperament of a drill sergeant and a hairstyle that hadn't moved since the coronation.
The rules for the workplace were as unspoken as they were absolute. Gloves were finally being abandoned, mostly because it is notoriously difficult to type 70 words a minute with woolly fingers, but the nails remained a defiant blood red. However, maintaining that perfect manicure was a battle against the machinery. The typewriter was a cruel mistress. One slip of a finger into the mechanical abyss between the keys, and your carefully applied Revlon Raven Red was chipped beyond repair. Then there was the Tipex. This white chalky liquid was the holy water of the secretarial world, a substance that smelled strongly of industrial solvents and promised to erase your mistakes.
In reality, it usually just left a crusty, visible scab on the parchment that screamed, "I am incompetent," to the entire accounts department. But we used it anyway, dabbing it on with the frantic precision of a bomb disposal expert, hoping the boss wouldn't notice the mountain of white paint rising from the page.
And when the work-day finally ended and the stress of the typing pool began to show in the form of dark, heavy circles under the eyes, the British woman turned to the only thing the country still had in abundance: tea. But this wasn't for drinking. The vanished ritual of the used tea bag was the morning after salvation for a weary generation. You would sit in the dim light of a damp morning, pressing cold, soggy bags of Earl Grey against your eyelids, hoping the tannins would miraculously erase the evidence of a late night spent in a smoke-filled pub or a long night spent worrying about the mortgage. It was a sticky, brown, and deeply undignified process, but in a world where expensive eye creams were a distant fantasy, a lukewarm tea bag was the only miracle we had. The pursuit of the perfect 70s silhouette didn't end when the sun went down. In fact, for many, the real ordeal was just beginning. This was the era of the foam roller, a deceptively soft name for what was, in practice, a medieval torture device. Every night, thousands of British women would painstakingly wind their damp hair around these cylinders, securing them with plastic pins that seemed designed to pierce the scalp at the slightest movement.
Trying to sleep with a head full of rollers was like trying to find rest on a bed of particularly stubborn rocks. You spent the night performing a precarious valet of neck angles, hoping to find a gap between the rollers that wouldn't result in a permanent spinal injury. But the alternative was unthinkable: waking up with flat hair. In the 70s, flat hair was a sign of a life poorly lived, a moral failing that no amount of tea could fix. You suffered the sleepless night because the reward, a voluminous, bouncy mane that could withstand a gale, was worth every agonizing minute of the midnight toss and turn. And then there was the pub ritual. The local boozer was the social heart of the 70s, a place of sticky carpets, dim amber lighting, and a level of cigarette smoke that made the great smog of '52 look like a light mist. For a woman, the challenge was to remain pristine in an environment that was actively trying to dissolve her makeup.
The pub mirror was the ultimate judge. Every hour there was the inevitable pilgrimage to the ladies, a cramped, freezing room where the plumbing was as temperamental as the national economy. There, under the flickering hum of a dying fluorescent tube, you would perform the dab. You didn't reapply, you merely patrolled the borders of your face with a tissue, desperately trying to soak up the humidity and the smell of hops without smudging the Biba plum masterpiece underneath. You emerged from that bathroom with a look of stoic composure, ready to return to your lukewarm gin and tonic, as if you hadn't just spent 5 minutes fighting a losing battle with a faulty hand dryer. It was a performance of grace under pressure, played out every Friday night across the kingdom. Eventually, the lights came back on, the 3-day weeks ended, the unions settled, and the 70s blared into the neon-soaked, shoulder-padded excess of the 80s. The tea bags returned to their cups, and the great clouds of hairspray finally dissipated, allowing the ozone layer a much-needed, if slightly wheezy, sigh of relief. Today, we look back at these rituals and see a strange, almost alien landscape of charcoal eyes and chemical fortresses. We wonder why they bothered, why they spent so much time fighting a war against the fog and the darkness with nothing but a kohl pencil and a prayer. But perhaps we're asking the wrong question. In a world that felt like it was unraveling at the seams, these women weren't just painting their faces, they were reinforcing their spirits.
The vanished beauty rituals of the 70s were the ultimate British defence mechanism. It was the refusal to be diminished by a drafty hallway or a flickering candle. It was the quiet, stubborn pride of walking into the gloom of a London evening and deciding that no matter how bleak the news might be, you would meet it with a perfect pout and a hairstyle that wouldn't budge for God or the government. Those women are older now, their Biba dresses tucked away in attics and their Elnett cans replaced by something far more sensible. But if you catch the scent of a heavy, musk-filled perfume on a cold London breeze, or see a flash of a defiant red lip in a rain-streaked window, remember them. They were the ones who taught us that even when the power fails and the world goes dark, the most important thing you can do is keep your head up, your eyeliner straight, and your sense of humour as dry as a gin and tonic. The fog remains, but the rituals have faded into the shadows of history, and perhaps in our modern, well-lit world, we've lost a little bit of that grit along the way. Keep your memory sharp and your spirit unshakable. This has been a look back through the lens of the Nostalgia Brit.